Hello humans, welcome to The Great Everything, the world's only podcast dedicated to art, donuts and transformation. I'm Patrick, a former banking lawyer who saw the light and quit to devote my existence to culture and philosophy, the greatest self-improvement tools of all. It's Art Day on The Great Everything, and we're talking about the bittersweetness evoked by the music of a great Russian composer born earlier this week on the 7th of May 1840, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. I often wonder what makes music different from any other art form. And of course, there's a number of different things we can pick out. With most things, the closer you look at them, the more you realize it's virtually impossible to neatly categorize and draw airtight comparisons. But with this question on the difference between music and the other art forms, the one idea I keep coming back to is that music somehow feels like it's connected to human emotion at a deeper level than any of the other arts. You look at a statue and you feel amazed by the artist's skill in recreating something lifelike out of inert marble. Or you read a novel and the words explicitly evoke a picture. They're describing something, a scene, an event, an emotion. But with music, and I mean specifically music without lyrics, where is the emotion coming from? Why should the sound of a violin have any emotional impact on us? Check this out. This is the beginning of Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto in D major. It feels like autumn, doesn't it? You might describe this as sad, as mournful, as tinged with longing or regret, kind of like looking back on a lost love. But why? What about this music is reminding us of those emotions? There's no physical image that's being created. There's no feeling that's being described. It's just sounds. Why is this sound making us feel sad? And why should another sound make us feel happy? Like here, listen to this. It's the opening to Tchaikovsky's first piano concerto. Hear it? This is far more joyful. If this is love, it's not lost love. We're right in the middle of love. It's the springtime of our love, as Cream would put it. So that's my question. Why do these sounds evoke different feelings? What is there in nature that these sounds are reminding us of? I'm baffled by this question. It's almost as though music has a kind of reach that no other art form can attain, because it's purely abstract. And somehow, it's uniquely tuned into our neurology. Because these are just sounds, arranged in a way that makes us feel something. It's pretty insane if you stop to think about it. And on this point, I don't think there's any composer that better embodies the ideal of music as expression of emotion than Tchaikovsky. No images, no words, just pure feeling. That's how Tchaikovsky saw music, not just as a means of attaining some higher artistic ideal, some abstract objective standard, but of recording human passion. In one of his letters, Tchaikovsky compares music to poetry, and he gives his own answer to that initial question about what makes music different from the other art forms. He says, quote, "The difference consists in the fact that music possesses far richer means of expression and is a more subtle medium in which to translate the thousand shifting moments in the mood of a soul." You say the name Tchaikovsky, and immediately you think big passions, intense emotions, breathtaking love, soul-squeezing tragedy, joy, sorrow, loneliness, mystery, the whole gamut of human emotion. But his specialty was a very specific feeling, that one point where beauty meets tragedy. His music best represents what Maria Popova calls an intimate tango of sadness and radiance. But all that sadness and radiance, it's coming from somewhere. Tchaikovsky's music is like a personal diary of his emotional states. And those emotional states were brutal. You know how we have this stereotype of the artist as someone who's somewhat tormented. Michelangelo, Baudelaire, Van Gogh, Kurt Cobain, the quintessential romantic artist is assailed by inner demons. He's filled with angst, possibly suicidal. Tchaikovsky fits this bill perfectly. His mental health was about as bad as you'll find in any artist in any era. He was a grade A neurotic, afflicted with what he described as, quote, a wearing, maddening depression. So oversensitive, his nanny called him a porcelain child. He was constantly on the verge of a mental breakdown, and a hypochondriac to the point of mania. There's too many anecdotes to count, but I always remember the one about how he became convinced that his head would fall off while he was conducting, so he'd actually prop it up with one hand while swishing around the baton with the other. Pretty bizarre sight that must have been. And his personal life was no better. Tchaikovsky was gay in Tsarist Russia, a society that was homophobic beyond anything we could even begin to imagine today in the West, unless we know someone in the Westboro Baptist Church. And actually, it's still pretty bad in Russia. I mean, Tchaikovsky's homosexuality is something that both the Soviet and the current Russian regimes have tried to ignore and even cover up. We're talking proper conspiracy to keep this hidden from the public. So you can imagine how much worse it would have been for homosexuals over a century ago. So what this meant was that while on the one hand Tchaikovsky did indulge his sexuality throughout his adult life, including cross-dressing and performing for a circle of friends as a female dancer, his whole life Tchaikovsky was terrified to the point of hysteria of being found out. Much of his music actually carries this element of love somehow denied or lost or obstacled, like in Eugene Onegin or Swan Lake or the overture to Romeo and Juliet. Speaking about his personal life, it was pretty interesting and crazy. Tchaikovsky had a ton of flings with other men, and also some great love stories. But I'd say that sentimentally, he was most defined by his relationship with two women. The first exacerbated all his mania and depression and suffering, Antonina Milyukova, the woman he married. And the second represented everything that was good in Tchaikovsky's life, Nadezhda von Meck, his patron and best friend. Now this is a great story. One day, Tchaikovsky wrote his brother, saying, I've been thinking, I need to find a wife. I'm gay, people are talking, there's rumors, you better find a wife, get some respectability, put the gossip to rest. So we're talking a sham marriage, obviously. And just a few days later, Tchaikovsky receives a bit of fan mail from a young lady named of Antonina Milyukova. Now she's clearly crazy about the great composer, so Tchaikovsky thinks, bingo! They meet up, and after just 2 meetings, Tchaikovsky proposes. She is over the moon and accepts, obviously. And 6 weeks later, they're married. Now, there's a problem. From everything we know, from correspondence and third-hand accounts, it should have been immediately clear to Tchaikovsky from that first meeting that Antonina was very, very unstable. Clearly unhinged, manically depressed, and on all accounts a woman of almost unfathomable stupidity. Antonina was also an nymphomaniac, as musicologist Robert Greenberg describes her, quote, a sex and affection-starved psychotic. Not the best match for a neurotically depressed gay man. The anecdotes from this period are comically tragic. Tchaikovsky spent most of the lead-up to the wedding locked in a room weeping. He arrived at the day of the wedding an absolute nervous wreck, and when invited to kiss the bride, he broke down in tears and fled, literally leaving her alone at the altar. A befuddled Antonina Milyukova had to attend the wedding banquet by herself. Tchaikovsky spent the whole honeymoon weeping. Antonina, completely unable to comprehend what was happening, decided that the best way to deal with this situation was to wear a little see-through gown and to try and seduce him. Naturally, he rejected her advances, and chaos ensued. This marriage situation was just too much for Tchaikovsky. In his correspondence, he wrote of his wife, quote, I hate her with every fiber of my being. And merely weeks after the wedding, Tchaikovsky attempted suicide by submerging himself naked in the freezing river. Even that failed. He didn't even catch a cold. Instead, he proceeded to have a full-on nervous breakdown. I love how Robert Greenberg puts this, quote, this would be hysterically funny if it wasn't so appalling. An oversensitive, secretive to the point of paranoia homosexual like Tchaikovsky having to deal with a mentally ill nymphomaniac. This particular incident so upset Tchaikovsky that he developed hemorrhoids, which he then convinced himself were fatal, to which end he began preparing his will. Who among us could make this up? His personal life wasn't all bad, though. A few weeks before that first fateful letter from Antonina Melyukova, Tchaikovsky received another letter from another fan. This one was from the tycoon Nadezhda von Meck, the widow of a railway magnate and one of the richest women in Russia. She wrote that she was a huge fan of Tchaikovsky's and that his music had touched her soul and changed her life for the better in countless ways. A correspondence began between Tchaikovsky and von Meck, and one of the great epistolary friendships of all time. Von Meck offered to finance his work with a stipend that by itself would suffice to make Tchaikovsky extremely comfortable for the next 13 years. All because she believed he was the greatest genius of his time and said, quote, "Only the most perfect of men can compose as you do." She wanted to put him in the condition to be able to create freely, unburdened by the demands of poverty. In return, she had one request, that he continue to write her as often as possible. And she added a condition: they were never to meet, lest he disappoint her idealized image of him as the quintessential genius composer. What an incredible patron of the arts! Which reminds me, if any of you enjoy what I do here, you too can send me 6,000 rubles. I promise to write you every weekend. So over the course of the next 13 years, von Meck and Tchaikovsky exchanged over 1,200 letters. He confessed everything to her: his passions, his desires, his sexuality. He explained his music, how it related to his life, and what it meant to him. I really couldn't recommend reading these letters more. They are a unique window into an artist's soul, and you can find them on Amazon for like $1. However, after 13 years, the letters from von Meck abruptly stopped. It's unclear exactly what happened, but it seems that von Meck's children took control of the financial estate and forced her to interrupt her association with Tchaikovsky. One hypothesis is that the children threatened to reveal his homosexuality to the world if she didn't do as they demanded. She knew how important that was to him and so would have done exactly as they asked. But if that's what happened, it probably wasn't worth von Meck abandoning him after all, because it seems likely that not only was his homosexuality eventually exposed, but it may have cost him his life. Tchaikovsky's death is shrouded in mystery. The official state-sanctioned version is that just a few days after the premiere of his masterpiece, the Sixth Symphony, Pathétique, he caught cholera and died. But recent scholarship tells a different story. And of course, this version is contested, but it's also got a lot of reputable support, and in any event, it's just too juicy and too tragic not to tell you. So this version goes that just a short while after the premiere of the Sixth Symphony, Tchaikovsky was summoned to a so-called court of honor, composed by his old schoolmates from the School of Jurisprudence. See, in this period, Tchaikovsky was having an affair with the nephew of a Russian count. And when the count found out about this affair, he was enraged and threatened to write a letter to the Tsar denouncing Tchaikovsky. The count's lawyer happened to be one Nikolai Jacobi. Tchaikovsky's death is shrouded in mystery. The official state-sanctioned version is that just a few days after the premiere of his masterpiece, the Sixth Symphony, Pathétique, he caught cholera and died. But recent scholarship tells a different story. And of course, this version is contested, but it's also got a lot of reputable support, and in any event, it's just too juicy and too tragic not to tell you. So this version goes that just a short while after the premiere of the Sixth Symphony, Tchaikovsky was summoned to a so-called court of honor, composed by his old schoolmates from the School of Jurisprudence. See, in this period, Tchaikovsky was having an affair with the nephew of a Russian count. And when the count found out about this affair, he was enraged and threatened to write a letter to the Tsar denouncing Tchaikovsky. The count's lawyer happened to be one Nikolai Jacobi, an alumnus of the School of Jurisprudence, so a schoolmate of Tchaikovsky's. And he found a way to make things quote-unquote right, in a way that wouldn't tarnish the school's reputation. This was apparently very important to Jacobi. Note that Tchaikovsky at this point was one of the most famous men in Russia, a national hero, and this is the age of nationalism, so something like this could seriously taint the standing of an entire nation. So Jacobi convened this court of honor of fellow alumni of the School of Jurisprudence, all lawyers and judges and politicians, and so they summoned Tchaikovsky. And after 5 hours of talks in Jacobi's study, Jacobi's wife said that Tchaikovsky just ran out of the room looking pale and disheveled. The court had reached a verdict. Tchaichovsky would preserve the school's and his own reputation by committing suicide. If he did this, the Count would refrain from involving the Tsar, and everyone's honor would remain intact. But it had to be done clean, so as to avoid a scandal. So Tchaikovsky began to take microdoses of arsenic, which I'm told at low doses mimics the symptoms of cholera. And so the story goes, died Russia's greatest composer, poisoning himself to spare the reputation of an ungrateful nation. And what did he leave behind? Countless beloved masterpieces: Romeo and Juliet, Onegin, Sleeping Beauty, Swan Lake, The Nutcracker, Symphonies No. 4 and 6 Pathétique, the First Piano Concerto, the Violin Concerto in D major, the Marche Slave, the Serenade for Strings, the 1812 Overture, and many, many others. Many of which capture that constant tension of a tortured soul, the contrast between beauty and sorrow, or perhaps the union of those two things, the bittersweet, the intimate tango of sadness and radiance. Now, some have criticized Tchaikovsky for being too saccharine, a cheap sentimentalist. And sure, with Tchaikovsky, there's none of the restraint and detachment of a Mozart or a Haydn. This is all heightened, the intensity's turned up to 11. But when Tchaikovsky's on his game, there is no single artist in any medium that can convey pure emotion to such astonishing effect. And the fact that he could do it so beautifully reveals a man who, while tormented by angst and various neuroses, was still very much in touch with the beauty in life. As he himself put it in a letter from 1870, quote, "I am sitting at the open window at 4 a.m. and breathing the lovely air of a spring morning. Life is still good, and it's worth living on a May morning. I declare that life is beautiful in spite of everything. In a word, there are many thorns, but the roses are there too." I hope you enjoyed today's episode of The Great Everything, and if you like the show, there's a few ways you can help out. You can leave a review on iTunes or anywhere else you listen to this podcast, or you can share it, embed it, talk about it on your podcast or write a blog about it, or you could just add me on the various Twitters and Instagrams out there. But if you want to be a part of the conversation, you can call in using Anchor, or you can look up The Great Everything on Facebook. I have a discussion group there where people talk about literally everything, from ethics to politics to Marvel movies. So if that's your thing, check it out. I hope I see you again here, there, or anywhere else, frankly. Until then, grazie e arrivederci.
Well, arrivederci, Luigi.
The podcast you just heard was recorded with Anchor. If you want to make your own, download the Android or iOS app completely free from anchor.fm/podcast. That's anchor.fm/podcast.